Confirmed cases of the coronavirus in the United States are on the rise, and news of that has helped lead to down days on the stock market and in some sectors of the United States economy, especially travel. But is the worst yet to come? That's where we lead off the discussion with Michael Szanto, economist, stock market analyst, and foreign policy commentator, and he joins us from Miami. Is the worst yet to come, Michael?
Very possibly, unfortunately, because it looks like we're at the beginning part of a major pandemic, and it's only really begun to spread in the United States.
How vulnerable, basically, why is the U.S. economy so 2,000 down? Why is it so vulnerable to the United States economy?
Well, let me say that fundamentally going into this, the United States economy was in many ways very strong. It's a very diversified, very robust economy. But on the other hand, there was a certain element of complacency on the part of the stock market. Valuations were stretched or overvalued. So I think that creates a little bit of a challenge. But, you know, this looks like, unfortunately, the biggest pandemic in a century, the most dangerous pandemic we faced in a century since the Spanish flu pandemic. And the efforts to contain it directly impact all kinds of economic activity, from air travel to cruises, obviously, to simply getting to work. People are now working from home, so they're not going to the places where they ordinarily go for lunch. You know, we see South by Southwest in Austin, Texas canceled. We see Ultra Music Festival already canceled in Miami. So we're facing a potential major disruption in our economic activity over the next few months.
How it affects all of us, let me ask Michael Szanto. Would you fly from Miami to Chicago today on a commercial airliner?
I would, but you know, one of the things that you need to consider is the potential role that you play in spreading it to, I'm not particularly at risk, but if you catch it and become infectious, contagious, you have to consider the effect that it would have on your family, anyone who's immunocompromised or elderly, and the possibility of it spreading. But you know, the vast majority of the population isn't horribly threatened by the virus, and you know, that is at least a minor half blessing, because Spanish flu pandemic actually did kill a lot of young adults. This one generally does not. It's the elderly that's most exposed. So yes, I would fly, but it's like a catch-22. Our efforts to contain the virus will largely actually slow our economy and be kind of a constraining force in spending and business activity overall.
Has it hit China the worst?
You know, from the reports that we're getting from China, China is perhaps actually already peaked in China, but China obviously is not a democracy. It's very authoritarian in many levels, so they've been able to impose pretty serious quarantines. We're seeing similar efforts now being done in Italy that are less effective. But it is almost amazing that the spread of this virus in China seems to have slowed quite a bit. But we've already faced major impacts on the global supply chain, because obviously China is very, very important in many industries in terms of its role in the supply chain.
Okay, another key question. Do you expect a recession this year?
It is unfortunately very, very likely, because we're facing a major supply and demand shock. What that means is our ability globally to produce goods has been really, really hit, and our ability to the demand, the desire to go to movie theaters or plays or travel has been greatly diminished. So both on the demand side and supply side, there's a major shock. So we haven't seen a potential for recession like that in many decades. At the same time, many central banks, including the central bank, have already reached very, very, very low, near zero interest rates. So they don't really have much ammunition on the part of monetary policy. So that's another problem. But because we're also facing, as I said before, a shock to supply, it can make it even tougher, because prices could actually go up. We can't assume that we will only face the disinflation that we faced in the last couple of decades, because supply constraints shortages can actually lead to prices rising. And that could make the job of the central banks around the world and the Federal Reserve even more complicated, even more challenging in this case.
Did you agree with the cut last week and another one coming, they say, March 18th?
Yes, I mean, the Federal Reserve has to try to play its role, but in this case, it might be more limited. By making it a more emergency action, it might have shaken the markets. But by looking at how much the stock market has dropped today, basically market falls were probably inevitable, because at this point in time, efforts to stop this virus or slow this virus are going to be very, very destabilizing, disrupting to our economic activities at this point. But the talk now of actually expanding to fiscal policy makes sense, so that there's not a shortage of money circulating. Monetary policy plays part of that role, but the Federal Reserve is somewhat tapped out at this point. So Congress can step up and help small businesses and other businesses, even cruise companies that have their businesses disrupted, so that we don't compound it with lots of employees being laid off or businesses directly affected by efforts to curtail this virus, not being able to pay their bills and snowballing. So, and today we're starting to see some hints of at least a minor liquidity and financial issues, that it's moving into basically the repo markets and other purely financial markets, so that we could face a credit crunch. So that the Fed can partly address with non-conventional policies, but Congress may have to step up and make sure, for example, people don't feel pressured to go to work if they're sick, but also if Congress helps through targeted fiscal policies of making sure that employees continue to get their wages, the employees, the consumers in the end, will continue to be able to hopefully spend and help lessen the potential impact of a potential recession, or lessen the severity of a potential recession.
I asked you, Michael, you said you would certainly fly from Miami to Chicago. Would you take a cruise ship to the Bahamas?
Oy. I mean, we're seeing ships kind of quarantined on occasion. I think that's going to lessen. I mean, assuming that the virus is at its worst right now, at some point there will be so much community spread of this virus that countries, including the United States, will likely not be so aggressive in quarantining the ships the way that they are, where people have to be quarantined at least for 14 days if a few people are on the cruise that are positive. That might end. So that is a ray of hope. I can't guarantee it, but basically we had a few ships where maybe just one patient started to unintentionally infect a bunch of people, and it became a petri dish for this coronavirus. But as we see more and more community spread within, for example, the United States and many other countries, I would anticipate the possibility that the threat of ships being quarantined is going to lessen, because it's going to be already in the United States and Europe and in East Asia, all over the place anyway, so that there will be less aggressive, which has put people on those affected ships through hell. So the risk of that could greatly diminish, as long as, God forbid, we don't, have an outbreak of something else, which is very, very unlikely. So, but that's going to be something that's going to be talked about once we get through this pandemic or this outbreak. But you've got to feel for the cruise industry right now. I think that their market valuations have already dropped, I believe, 50%, but it could get worse, because even once the spread of this virus stops, there's a good chance that this would. So you asked me if I would take a cruise. At some point, yes, I'd consider it, but I also imagine that, well, right now there's still a risk of getting quarantined, frankly.
How do you think the federal government's been handling this?
We have seen, for the whole duration of the Trump administration, poor handling of information and misleading information that has continued at this point. This is, as I said, the worst pandemic, the most dangerous pandemic that we've seen in a century. So it's a very challenging situation. I think in many ways the CDC and even FDA and other government agencies have done a good job. So I just think that communications, you have to be open with American people. You have to be giving good, reliable information, not shake the American public's confidence more than necessary. But I think this could potentially challenge, by the way, our medical system. And I think once we get through this, at least hopefully it'll allow us to be more prepared for the next outbreak of something, which is inevitable, but hopefully the next one is contained and doesn't become a pandemic. But I don't really think, that maybe if China had acted a little bit quicker, that it could have been contained at that point, perhaps. But we may face in the future viruses that are more contagious and even, unfortunately, deadlier. So this is also, I think, good practice so that if something else pops up 10, 20 years from now, we'll hopefully be more prepared. From the federal government to hospitals to everyone, to cruise lines, airlines, everyone.
What manufacturers that are doing well, I guess, would be those that make face masks and hand sanitizers. What industry, other than obviously the travel industry, is getting hit the hardest by this?
That's interesting. Well, potentially it's going to be widespread. That's why we're seeing stock market losses that are just across the board. I think that almost no companies are going down 10%, at least 10% at this point. And a lot of companies are going down at least 20%. We're also seeing now, of course, a oil pricing war between Russia and Saudi Arabia, which is hitting U.S. energy stocks really, really hard, especially of fracking companies, which may be a little bit intentional because that's another competitor. So we see the blessing is we're going to get very, very low oil prices. On the flip side, as we start to get through, and if we get out of this crisis where the virus ultimately subsides, I think if it turns out kind of bad, one of the assessments is going to be that we need to invest even more in our emergency rooms throughout the country and ICUs for preparedness for things particularly like viral outbreaks. So, but it's very systemic. Like right now we're seeing even elements of at least a minor financial crisis where the Fed actually has to step in and actually start to back financial institutions in the United States and globally and make sure that there's adequate dollar supply globally.
Michael, thank you so much for your time today.
You're very, very welcome.